I remember a birthday party that my mother did when I think I was 6. It could have been 7. I remember this party very clearly. Kids running around in our backyard, a big picnic table on our newly screened-in porch with a birthday cake on it. I remember all these details, even though it was only 6 or 7, mainly because that was the only birthday party I ever had. Apparently, I was in a really grumpy mood that day, and somehow got it through my head that because we're playing all of these games at my birthday party, that I was supposed to win all the games. And when I didn't, I evidently, well, hey, it was my party. I can cry if I want to. Right? But it was such a pill that Mom never gave me another party, which you can understand. Here she went to all this trouble, all the cake, all the ice cream, invited all of the kids, and with everything perfect, I found something to gripe and grumble and complain about, which is kind of a metaphor for the way that we live our lives, right? We have everything, no matter where we are in the socioeconomic scale in America. All of us have enough food to eat. All of us here, anyway, have enough food to eat. We have enough clean water where all we have to do is just go to the spigot and draw us a glass of water. And we have a warm place to live in the wintertime and even cool place usually in the summertime. Now, just based on that, food, water, and shelter, a large percentage of the world's population would immediately switch places with us without knowing anything else about our lives because they don't have all those things. And yet, even though we have food to eat, water to drink, and a place to live, we spend so much of our time griping and complaining about the way things are. We complain with our mouths full, so to speak. And that kind of brings us to what we want to talk about this morning. We've been looking at the impossible commands, and we've gone mission impossible. How do we keep commands in Scripture that seem to be, at least on the surface, impossible? Last week we looked at Jesus' request that all of his followers, all of his disciples be one, just as Father and Son are one. In fact, he said, this is how all men will know, all people will know that they are my disciples by the way that they love one another. And we mentioned that all through the New Testament there are these texts that, you could preach a series, as I mentioned last week, in Corinthians and Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and many of the other books of the New Testament, and get large sections that deal with unity. And that's the case in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul says, and make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one in mind. So he's talking about this desire that he has for the church at Philippi, which he has this really close relationship with. He talks about the partnership that he's enjoyed with them in the gospel from the first day until the time when he was writing. He values this church. It's almost like it's his home church, and yet if you read carefully the book of Philippians, you find that they have had some problems getting along with each other. So here he says he wants, his joy will be complete if they, and then he uses a series of synonyms. In fact, you could translate it this way: having the same mind, the same love, the same mind, and the same mind. So very obviously he wants them to be unified in mind and spirit as they fulfill that partnership they have with the gospel. And he goes on in the next verse to talk about what that looks like. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. So this unity they are to pursue comes from a willingness to value others above yourselves. Is that possible? I mean, that could be our impossible command, right? Can we really value other people above ourselves? Does he really mean that? And don't look to your own interest, but to the interest of others. Well, yeah, that's exactly what he says, and evidently it's exactly what he means, because he goes on to give the illustration of Jesus at the cross. Paul always comes back to the story of the cross. That's what Paul knows better than anything else. And so for him, the example of how we are to get along and how we are to value the interests of others, how we are to put others on a level even above ourselves is what Jesus did for us at the cross, right? Jesus didn't gain anything from the experience of coming down to earth and suffering and dying on the cross. Sometimes we may try to make ourselves think that he did, that he gained some valuable experience. Now he knows what we feel like. Well, he was on all. Paul starts this by saying, have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being equal to God, didn't grasp that, but gave it up. Humbled himself, became obedient even to death on the cross. What is he saying? Well, he's saying that Jesus was on the same level of God. He knows everything there is to know. He doesn't learn anything. But yet he emptied himself. He humbled himself because that was what we needed. And so the appeal that Paul makes here is to come to seek to meet the needs of others, just like Jesus did when he died on the cross. And then later in the same context, he says this, do everything without grumbling or arguing. That's our impossible command for today. Do everything without grumbling and arguing so that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation, and then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. So the way that we live together in unity has a lot to do with how successful we are in doing everything without grumbling and complaining. In fact, Jesus said that, what we sang last week, they'll know you're Christians by your love. If all men will know you're my disciples. Here he says that if you do everything without grumbling and arguing, you will shine like stars in the sky. You will be a beacon for the truth of the gospel. If we're going to live together in the unity we talked about last week, then we're going to have to learn how to live together without grumbling and arguing and complaining. We're going to use the example of Israel on the Exodus as an object lesson this morning in talking about grumbling and complaining. And I sort of set this up in the bulletin article, so sometime today, not now, read the bulletin article to get a little bit of background for where I'm going here. Numbers 10 begins a new chapter in Israel's history. They are finally ready to break camp. Up to this point, everything that happens in Exodus after they come to Mount Sinai happens while they're camped at Mount Sinai. Well, now they're finally going to break camp, and they're going to head for Canaan. In fact, they're probably, as they're breaking down their tents and as they're packing up all of their utensils and they're getting ready for the trip, they are surely singing together, I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? Because they are bound for the promised land. So everything should have been hopeful, everything should have been exciting, and it was for a moment. And then as we start chapter 11, now the people complained about the hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. So the excitement of the trip is soon lost as they are bogged down. It's a long way to walk. It's dusty, it's dry, and they start complaining about the hardships of the journey. You can almost hear the Israelites as they're traveling along shouting to Moses, are we there yet? And they begin to grumble and complain, and God isn't having any of it. And so a fire comes and burns the outside part of the camp just to get their attention. And it works, but only momentarily. Then in verse 4, the rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. Oh, okay, so now it's not just the difficulty of the trip, it's the fact that they have to eat the same thing over and over again. God prepares manna, which just appears in the morning. All they have to do is go out and pick it up and eat it. It's sweet, it's bread-like. We don't know anything else about it other than the comparisons there. But all their needs are met. But they get tired of eating just that. I know every once in a while we'll go out to eat somewhere at a restaurant and the food is not quite up to, it's not really all that good. And so I may say something about that. And Lynn will say, any meal I don't have to fix is good enough with me. And so all they had to do was walk outside of camp and pick it up. And no. They want meat. And they said, if we just were back in Egypt, we had plenty of meat back there. Forgetting, of course, they were slaves back there and probably didn't have all that much meat to begin with. So once again, they complain, and once again, it gets, God hears, and he gets their attention, and some of them suffer because of it. And then in chapter 12, we just barely get past that story when Miriam and Aaron, the sister and brother of Moses, get in on the act. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. So now leadership is complaining about Moses. So Miriam and Aaron are in leadership roles. Aaron is Moses' spokesman. They're right there together a whole lot of the time, but now they're complaining. Now on the surface they're complaining because Moses marries a Cushite, an Ethiopian. But that's not really what they're complaining about. The next verse tells us what they're really complaining about is Moses is getting the lion's share of the credit as leader. And they think, well, we're leaders too. We should get some of that credit. I bet you in a heartbeat, Moses would have turned the whole job over to them and retired to Miami. This was not an easy job that Moses had. But they're complaining. And again, God strikes them and gets their attention. Until finally that leads into the next part of the story when they finally get to the Jordan River and the Promised Land. In chapter 13, Moses sends out spies because they couldn't just pull up a Google Earth representation of to get the lay of the land. So he sends spies out. Joshua and Caleb, the two faithful spies, come back and say the land is wonderful. God has given us a wonderful land and will give it into our hands. But all the rest of the spies and all the rest of the people, all they can see is that the land is filled with large walled cities that are going to be very difficult to take. And it's full of giant people that were like grasshoppers in their sight. And so the people began to complain against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. The people are ready to rebel against Moses and Aaron and elect a new leader and go back to Egypt. And when Moses and Aaron tries to intervene, they decide to stone them to death. But of course, God intervenes and puts down this rebellion. He is going to destroy the whole people, and Moses intervenes, and so he decides, okay, this whole bunch of Israelites, this whole generation are going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until every one of those who left Egypt are dead. And I will bring their children and their children's children into the land of promise. Indeed, they had said, if only we would just have died in the wilderness. God said, wish granted. That's exactly what's going to happen. They complained about the difficulties of the journey. They're going to spend the rest of their lives making that journey, wandering in circles in the desert. All because they grumbled against the Lord. See, the story shows three issues with complaining. That grumbling and complaining, being negative all the time, shows three different problems. First, it's a gratitude problem. I mean, think about all the things that Israel experienced, all the times that God intervened to save them. How he created the plagues that caused Egypt to let the people go out of slavery. How he protected them at the Red Sea and destroyed the enemy army. How when they were attacked by other enemies in the desert, he gave them victory even though they had no experience whatsoever in warfare. How he fed them and gave them water when there was none in the desert. All along the way, God was taking care of them, but when they get to the banks of the Jordan, all they can see is the difficulty of what lays ahead, and they show absolutely no gratitude for all of the things that God has done. They're me on my 6th birthday, where After everything is taken care of, they find something negative. They complain, they grumble against God. And so it is with us. God has given us so much. And like Israel, if we complain, we always complain with our mouths full. We have so much. God continues to want to bless us, but sometimes our hands are so full, busy trying to grasp more stuff that we can't be grateful for the things that God has given to us. How dare we complain after God has been so good? So grumbling and complaining always show a gratitude problem. They also show a memory problem. The Israelites hear the reports about the walled cities, huge walls, and huge people, the giants in the land. And they forget how God turned the Nile River into blood, how God caused the sun to be blotted out for 3 days, how God caused all of those other plagues to fall on Egypt, how God destroyed the army of the Egyptians. They forgot about all the good things that God had done. But also, think about it. Their reasoning is, if we just could go back to Egypt when things were good. That also shows a memory problem, a forgetting problem. They forgot that the good old days weren't so good. Sometimes we get a little bit carried away, wishing things were like they used to be. Well, I had a professor that said that one time, and he said, but I remember how I grew up. I kind of like my plumbing indoors. The good old days weren't all that good. We just conveniently forget about the bad parts of it. So Solomon in Ecclesiastes 7 says, do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. Yeah, the good old days aren't any better than now. It's just that our memory doesn't work. We choose to remember the good parts that we want to remember and filter out the bad things. So the Israelites had this memory problem that caused their grumbling and complaining because they just had forgotten all the good times, all the good things that God had done for them, and they conveniently forgot how things were before God, that the good old days weren't quite so good. But ultimately, of course, grumbling and complaining is a faith problem. They grumbled because they did not trust God. They didn't trust God to provide for them in the wilderness. They did not trust God to give them victory. They didn't trust God to be able to defeat the giants. They didn't trust that God could defeat the walled cities. They simply did not trust God, and they began to grumble and complain because of it. It's a faith issue. Here's what Moses said after an earlier grumble tumble that Israel took, complaining about the food. He said, because he has heard your grumbling against him, who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. No. Moses wasn't the one driving the bus. God was the one driving the bus. So ultimately, when they come to Moses again and again, in fact, there's a couple times where Moses turns to God and throws up his hands and is completely frustrated dealing with this complaining, grumbling people. They come in, they complain to Moses, and Moses says, listen, I'm not the one doing this. God is leading us. When you complain to God. In fact, it would be so much better if we would just complain to God. That's not what we do, though. When we are dissatisfied, the old saying, misery loves company. We grumble and complain to others because we want them to be as unhappy with things as we are. Years ago, the elders made a mistake, strategic mistake. Not when they hired me, that was another one. But there was a couple of families that had some issues they wanted to talk about, and so they wanted a meeting with the elders. Well, there was like 4 different families, and they each complained about or wanted some changes made in one area. So the elder said, well, rather than making 4 different individual meetings, we'll just have a big meeting, invite all 4 families to come. Well, talk about a grumble session. See, each family came concerned about one thing, but they left grumbling and complaining about 4 things, because that's what grumbling does. It shares your dissatisfaction with other people. Needless to say, that they learned from that. No more grumble meetings, just one-on-one meetings from now on, sort of thing. Grumbling and complaining does such damage to the unity of the church because it spreads around dissatisfaction and unfaithfulness. But if you pour out your complaint directly to God, don't share it with other people, but take it straight to the Lord. There's a technical expression for doing that in the Bible. It's called prayer. In Psalm 55 in verse 16, "But I call upon the Lord, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he will hear my voice, and he will redeem me unharmed from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me." When we complain directly to God, we are complaining to the only one who has the ability to hear and act on our complaint. See, we complain to each other, nothing is going to be changed. But prayer works because God can change things, and prayer can change God. C.S. Lewis once said, "Hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others." We tend to dismiss complaining and grumbling as a quirk of personality. I mean, some people are just negative Nancy, right? They just complain about everything. Not only is the glass not half full, it's half empty, and it's dirty. Besides, I don't like that glass anyway. We've all known people that were so negative and complaining about everything, we just didn't like being around them. But I hope we've seen from this example of Israel that grumbling and complaining is not just a quirk of personality. It's a lack of faith in God, a lack of gratitude for all that God has done for us. And it is so deadly to the unity of the church. Paul uses this same Exodus story to make a series of points as he's dealing with the church at Corinth. He says this in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters." Now, here's where I think the NIV messed up the translation. This is a whole lot better in the King James, because the King James says, "I would not have you ignorant brethren." And, there's just some times when you don't want to have ignorant brethren, but that's not what he's saying. "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they passed through the sea." He's going to be tying together the experience of Israel during the Exodus with our experience as Christians in the church. He's going to say we share some things in common. First of all, we're the chosen people. They were the chosen people. We're the chosen people. And then he says they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Okay, so you see the analogy he is making is, we're baptized, they were baptized, in the sense that they passed through the sea on 2 sides of the cloud over them. That's kind of like baptism. And we eat the spiritual food every Sunday as we share in the table of the Lord. Well, they ate the manna and drank the water that came from the rock. So they're sharing these experiences. But then he says in verse 5, "Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." Okay, if you get lackadaisical, if you go on autopilot, if you take your spiritual lives for granted, you may end up in the same boat as Israel did. Hey, but we're the chosen people of God. We're the redeemed of the Lord. Yeah, so were they. They stopped living like it, and they end up being destroyed in the wilderness. This is a warning for us not to get too sloppy and entitled by the way that we approach our spiritual life. He's going to say a little bit later, the verse we looked at briefly on Wednesday night, "To the one who thinks he stands, take heed, you just might fall." That we totally, continually need to be taking stock of who we are. So that's the example that he sees in Israel. And then he's going to make some more specific applications in the verses that follow. So in verse 7, do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Okay, these were the chosen people of God, but remember the golden calf? How when Moses and Joshua were up on the mountain and they're coming down, and Joshua thought the sound that they heard in the camp was war, but no, it was a big party because they had made an idol and they were worshiping this golden calf. So to a church in Corinth, which was one of the pagan capitals of the world where idols were everywhere, don't be like the example of the Jews on the Exodus who were turned aside because of idolatry. And then he goes on to say, you should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and one day 23,000 of them died. Remember the story of Balaam, how the Moabites wanted to pay Balaam to curse the Israelites. So he was a prophet of God, and he couldn't curse the Israelites because God wouldn't let him. But for enough money, he whispered to the king that, hey, but if you send a bunch of loose women into the camp, they'll commit adultery and God will kill them for you. So to a church that was in the middle of one of the most decadent places in the Roman. In fact, they were so decadent in Corinth that it sort of offended the Romans. They referred to prostitutes by the word Corinthian girl. That was a term used for prostitutes. There was so much prostitution going on in Corinth. So as Christians, don't get sidetracked in sexual immorality. And then the application for us. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. The three deadly sins, kind of like an unholy trinity of sins that Paul uses the Exodus to warn the church of Corinth about. Don't commit idolatry, don't commit sexual immorality, and don't grumble and complain. We probably wouldn't equate those sins as being equally dangerous, but Paul did, because God does. May God help us to be such a grateful people for all that God has done and in all the ways that God has blessed us, that we never give in to the grumbling and complaining attitude that we see exemplified in Israel in the story that we've looked at. May we walk by faith no matter how bumpy the road may become. And may we be faithful overall, and again, never give in to the grumbling, complaining spirit. Realizing that when I grumble and complain, it certainly doesn't do me any good. And it also tears down those I grumble and complain to. And may we trust God enough so that we take our complaints directly to Him in faithfulness and in prayer, and expecting Him to be the one to provide what we need. As we sing this next song, our elders will be at the back of the auditorium. If there is something you've been struggling with, then we encourage you to go to the back while we're singing and let them know. Perhaps you can go with one of them down to the prayer room and spend some time praying this morning. Or if not, then they can just share with the rest of us what we need to be praying for you about. If you're ready to step into this life of faith that Jesus died to make possible for us, if you're ready to join Him in that story of His death, burial, and resurrection, and are ready to be baptized to have your sins washed away, then again, as we're singing this song, go to the back and make that known. The call this morning is for us all to be faithful before the Lord. And so let's challenge each other as we stand and sing.